Hello again. So today, or this video rather, we're gonna just look at different parts of the carbon cycle really quickly. So I'm gonna look at my other screen while I do this. But so here I have a picture of the carbon cycle, and I'm gonna oversimplify a couple of things here, and we'll dive into some others in another video. We can start wherever, but here I think one of the biggest things that you should note is that in this picture we show atmospheric carbon, right? Generally in the form of carbon dioxide, which is what we think about, right? We breathe out carbon dioxide when we exhale. There's also other forms of carbon in the atmosphere, specifically methane is pretty common. But when we talk about places where carbon can be in the environment, we tend to refer to them as carbon sinks. And the atmosphere is a major carbon sink. So from there, we can have two arrows. We have one going to this plant, one going to this plant. This one's labeled, even though they both apply. And we'll talk more as to about exactly what's going on here. But in this section, the way that atmospheric carbon comes out of the atmosphere and goes into organisms in the environment is through something called photosynthesis. All right, and so exactly what that looks like we will dive into in a different video. But photosynthesis will take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into plants specifically, or whatever organism is doing the photosynthesis. And in photosynthesis, plants turn that carbon into more usable molecules, specifically for energy. So it'll turn it into something like a sugar or carbohydrate. A couple of things can then happen. So that plant might be eaten. This sort of takes the arrow here from a plant to this animal, or from this plant to this animal. Is that it becomes food, right? So that's one option for what can happen to the carbon from there, is it can be eaten by something else. And that can go on for a long time, right? An insect might eat that, and then a frog might eat that insect, and then a larger animal might eat that frog, and then we might eat that larger animal for all we know, right? And so all of that can go on in it's own little process. And we're not showing all of like a food web in particular. But we are seeing that animals or other organisms can then consume the carbon once the plant has turned it into something usable. The other thing that can happen to this is that the plant can die, and over a long period of time, it can become a fossil fuel of some sort, right? Our general fossil fuels are actually really old organisms over long periods of time that have become natural gas or oil. So either way, it's going to a different place as a carbon sink. And then one option, once it becomes a fossil fuel, is that it can then go through combustion. It can be burned, right? We do this when we burn wood in a fireplace or at a campfire or something like that. We also do this in our vehicles when we use oil or natural gas or something like that to power our vehicles, or even our computers, depending on how you get your energy at your home. That process will ultimately release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So that's a small little cycle right there. Some other options here, both animals and plants, as we mentioned, release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through something called respiration. That's another way. And then the animals can ultimately actually not release their carbon. At some point, that animal will die, and that will return a certain amount of carbon back into the environment.